Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Scottish Trade Union Congress's Scottish Parliament election hustings. Very glad to have you all with us tonight. I'm Bill Scott. I'm chair of the Poverty and Inequality Commission for Scotland. We monitor progress towards meeting the child poverty reduction targets and provide advice to the Scottish Parliament on what actions they might take to further reduce child poverty in Scotland. As chair of the hustings, I'm going to have to be completely impartial tonight, as chairs should be in any case, but in this case it's especially important because as the Commission is a public body, I'm bound by Purdah rules, and if I don't obey them, who knows, I could end up in the Tower, or even worse, I might lose my job. So I'll be very careful and try to be as impartial as possible. given the fact that I have been a lifelong trade unionist, that will be difficult. But if you see me smiling or nodding my head or shaking my head in disagreement, it might seem it's not actually that. It's just an involuntary tic caused by endless months of Zoom meetings, and not actually my agreement or disagreement with any of our distinguished panel. And I'm delighted to be joined by the panel this evening. They're here to answer your questions from trade union reps and members across Scotland on some of the key issues facing workers today. And that is what tonight is really about, is putting the voice of workers right at the centre of this quite special election campaign being conducted under circumstances that are very unique. So I'm really grateful to be joined by Alistair Carmichael, representing Scottish Liberal Democrats, Patrick Harvie from the Scottish Green Party, Nicola Sturgeon from the Scottish National Party, Stephen Kerr from the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, and Sarwar from Scottish Labour. Last year has been a huge challenge to our society, and particularly a huge challenge to workers. Many families have been affected by poverty during the pandemic. And we know that it's been the key workers in our society, health and social care, transport and education, who have been at the forefront of continuing to deliver services in very, very difficult circumstances and very dangerous circumstances. And some of those workers are on low incomes. It's particularly personal to me. My daughter, our daughter, is training to be a nurse at the moment, about to join the health service. So what we want to hear about is whether in the recovery that is coming, that those workers and their families, where are they placed? And all of the parties have committed to recovery, but tonight we want to hear from them exactly how they're going to go about supporting workers and their families in that recovery. So thanks to everyone who's joined us online, and to those who've submitted questions in advance. We'd encourage you to take part in tonight's debate by sharing your comments on Facebook and Twitter and using hashtag People's Recovery if you want to contribute. The online format unfortunately gives us limited options for a traditional debate. I will be doing my best to ensure that all the candidates are given the opportunity to answer each question that's put to them. And when time is available, to respond to the answers that have been given by the other members of the panel. And we'll cover as many questions as possible in the time available. And I'd ask the panel to try and keep as far as possible to the time, so that we can hear all the questions, because, as I said earlier, we really want to hear what those workers' experiences have been and how we might respond to some of the problems that they face as we enter, hopefully, into recovery. So our first section this evening will be a focus on pay, with contributions from Unison and the Fire Brigade Union. And the first will see a short video with local authority pay issues and experience, and then move on to another video with a question. And that'll be followed by the panel providing answers, and I'll call each of you in turn when we get to that part. So could we have the first video, please?
Hi, I'm Brian Ash. I'm a primary school janitor in Glasgow. My union is Unison, and I want to talk about the pay award that was put forward for the low-paid workers of Glasgow. MD earns under £25,000 a year has been offered £800. So that covers most of the staff that work within our schools. i.e. janitorial, catering, cleaning, school crossing patrollers. We kind of feel that this is quite a derisory offer, considering we've all worked through the pandemic. We've basically been expected to turn up every day to come and do our normal job, and under these conditions as well. There's lots of additional cleaning tasks and stuff involved. The actual council, they don't seem to get the enormity of the tasks that are involved, and they just say, get on with it. My question to all the parliament leaders are, if you were elected or re-elected, how will you support local governments and the local authority and key workers, financially or otherwise, who are key to the recovery?
This pandemic has been very hard for firefighters, especially dealing with the constant fear of contracting COVID-19. But not only the fear of catching it, there's a real fear of spreading it onto your colleagues and family members back home. All the public sector workers have worked extremely hard for years. However, over the last decade, their pay has been falling in real terms. Last year, we tried to secure a deal for the firefighters that would see their role change, but only in a way that would guarantee the safety of staff and the people we serve. This is going to need a real commitment from the next Scottish Government to fund a package that can make all these things happen. What do the parties have to say to the firefighters and the public sector workers about how their work will be valued in the future?
Right, so I'll pass over to the panel now. Anna Sarwar, Scottish Labour.
Thank you, Chair. And like you, can I repeat the recognition for all the frontline workers who went above and beyond over the course of the pandemic, and thank all the trade unions that represented them and fought their corner over the last year and beyond. A really important point is, like, out in the doorstep, we applauded, we said thanks, but that's got its part to play. But actually, we need to recognise and reward all our frontline workers too. And I thought the point made by the FBU was the most important one. Is this was frontline workers who were risking their own lives and potentially taking the virus back to their own members of their family in order to keep our country running. And that's why they deserve a fair pay increase. So that's going to be done in negotiation with their trade unions and make sure it's a package that adequately rewards them. But we can't miss out the connection, particularly for those local government workers, between the year-on-year to local government over the last decade, that being the budget then available to local government, and then the pay offer that they can then give to their workers. So I want us to stop the cuts to local government. I want us to properly invest in local government, have a new pay deal and settlement with local government so they can afford to, yes, pay their staff, but also deliver on local public services at the same time. And I pledge to work with all of our trade union colleagues and the local government and the FBU and others to make sure we have a fair pay increase that represents the immense work that all our colleagues in the front line have done over the last year.
Thanks very much, Anis. Alistair, Carmichael.
Be prepared to make sure that the people that you're clapping on the Thursday night then get a decent pay packet on the Friday. The question of public sector pay, though, is one where I think we have there's no single answer to it. For workers in the care sector, for example, we would like to see them move on to a national collective bargaining basis. For teachers, we want to see a rerun of what we had in the early years of the century with the Macron Commission, something that would look not just at pay, but also at conditions, the amount of contact time they have, routes to promotion, and all the rest of that. I thought that the point from the Fire Brigade Union there actually essentially took us on to very much the same sort of territory, because public sector pay is going to be one part of it, but I think that just about every sector that I encounter in my daily work as a Member of Parliament does actually see the connection between pay and conditions and modernisation and efficiencies and the rest of it. And I think the most important thing is that we start from a position of respect, and I think that's where we've missed out too often in the past.
Thanks very much, Alistair. Nicola, Sturgeon.
Thanks, Bill. And firstly, can I say a big thank you to the trade union movement, the STUC and individual trade unions for the contribution you make generally, but particularly for the contribution over the past year, and say a massive thank you to public sector workers who have, as we just heard in the videos there, gone above and beyond the call of duty, and there are no words that I can find to adequately express my appreciation, but words are not enough. We are rightly answering a question here about pay. We set a public sector pay policy. It's just a statement of fact. We have to make sure we have the money to deliver pay. It has to be affordable. The Tory pay freeze has a knock-on effect in our budget. But within that, we are determined to deliver fair and progressive pay. The £800 cash underpin for those earning under £25,000 a year amounts to a 3% wage increase. Obviously, though, in individual groups of workers, pay settlements have to be negotiated. I can't negotiate a local government settlement for local government, but I would encourage councils to be fair. Councils have had for this financial year a 3% uplift in their core settlement to help obviously ensure fair pay for workers. The point about firefighters is very well made. We have been trying to get a pay deal that modernises and changes the role of firefighters, but also ensures fair pay. The point that was made that will require investment from the Scottish Government is one we have recognised. I'm not going to preempt the negotiations, but I'm really, really hopeful that we can get to a fair, decent settlement there that provides firefighters with the pay they deserve, but also brings the role up to date in the way that I know many firefighters want. But fair pay, progressive pay, recognising the low pay issues that many live with is an absolutely key principle.
Thanks very much. Patrick Harvie.
Thanks very much, and like others, thank you for the invitation to take part tonight. And you know, we're all going to say some variation on the theme, aren't we, of recognising the contribution and the extraordinary work of public sector workers, but also saying that thanks is not enough, and recognition needs to come in the form of fair pay as well. I think the Green track record in recent years, especially during the period of minority government, when all political parties should be and can put forward good ideas to push the government beyond its comfort zone, particularly during budget negotiations, the Green track record has been one of repeatedly putting public sector pay as a high priority, generally and specifically, for example, in relation to teachers. We've made that difference. And when we've done that, we've tried very hard to keep in close contact with the trade union movement during those discussions. But we've also made it clear that it's only a baseline, that it only strengthens the starting point in negotiations between public sector employers and the unions, that it's not an end point in those negotiations, it's a stronger starting point. The last thing I want to say is, yes, Nicola Sturgeon is right that a desire for a fairer pay settlement needs to be affordable. Greens have shown how that can be done, not by waiting for Westminster, but by reforming taxation. It's because of Green work that we have a fairer tax system on income tax in Scotland that's put £500 million extra into the Scottish budget by raising revenue from those who can afford to pay more. Unless we continue that, and unless we replicate that kind of progressive tax reform at local level as well, we won't have the resources to do more. I think we can have both the fairer, more equal society that progressive taxation provides and the resources to do better on public sector pay in future.
Thanks, Patrick. Stephen Kerr.
Yeah, I join with the other panellists in thanking all of those who've made it possible for us to have our lives carry on in many different vital aspects of the services that are provided by public sector workers. I think that our understanding of what key work or essential work is has definitely changed over the last year for all of us. Now, we absolutely support the proposed 4% increase for NHS workers in their pay. But I think it's also right to ask, what about the other public sector workers, particularly teachers and firefighters have been mentioned, and local government workers in general? We, after all, have to be able to attract good people into those jobs, and salary pay is part of the recognition that they rightly deserve. I think perhaps there are just too many six-figure salaries in the public sector in Scotland at the minute, and not enough money being directed into frontline service providers. The Scottish Conservatives at this election are proposing a fairer funding structure for councils. We propose to pass into law that local councils will receive a set fraction of the Scottish Government budget every year. We believe that for the last few years, the SNP have been grabbing cash from local authorities in the sum of billions. And it's time to reverse that. It's time to give local councils the funding they need to provide the services that we really all depend on. And my last point would be this, that in order to have the public services that we all need and value, we need a strong economy. There's a strong interdependent relationship.
Thank you, Stephen.
Conservatives are saying that we would make jobs and the creation of jobs a priority for the next Parliament.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes left, so I'll ask Nicola Sturgeon to respond, because she's had a couple of comments made about the government's record, but I'll try and draw you all in if I can.
So, it's the responsibility of the Scottish Government to address these things, and Patrick's right, we reformed the income tax system to make it more progressive and to raise more funding. So we've put our money where our mouth is on that. I have to say it's just a bit galling to listen to Stephen Kerr there, though, talk about welcoming 4% for the NHS from a Scottish Government, but defending a 1% offer from the Tories in England, calling for better pay deals for other public sector workers when the Tories are imposing a pay freeze on other public sector workers, which has a knock-on effect on our budget. So we'd be able to do more in Scotland if the Tories didn't just call on the Scottish Government to do things, but actually called on their own government to make available the wherewithal to do that. And in terms of local authority funding, it's been a tough time for local authorities after 10 years of Tory austerity. But, if you look at the period from 2013 to 2020, Scottish local authorities had a cash terms revenue budget increase of about 3.6%. That's a real terms reduction. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But in place of that cash terms increase in Scotland, there was a cash terms budget reduction of 15% for councils in England. So, we need to not just have Tories call on the Scottish Government to do the right thing, we actually need to see Tories do the right thing, and that would make our lives here in Scotland just that bit easier.
Anas.
Just come out, I don't think it's good enough just to say at least we're not as bad as that lot down the road. So the reality is that there have been year-on-year cuts, 10 years of cuts, almost £1 billion taken out of local government in Scotland, and that has impacted on local services and impacted on local pay. So I agree. I disagree with what the Tories are doing down the road, but we can't point over there. We're in charge here in Scotland. This election is about what we can have the power to do. And Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP set the budget in Scotland. They set the settlement for local government. So let's not pretend Boris Johnson or the Tories do it. So I agree. I'm happy to join any attacks on the Conservative Party with Nicola Sturgeon, but let's talk about what power we have here in Scotland, the difference we can make. That's, after all, what this election is about.
I'm afraid we're going to have to move on and leave it there, as we do want to hear all the other questions. But I'm sure people will take the opportunity to come back in, maybe on some of the other questions that are being put. There will be more opportunity to respond, believe me. So over the last year, we've seen essential work done by carers who've been working on the front line during the pandemic. And we'll now take two questions from Unison and Unite the Union.
I am a support worker for a Scottish charity organisation. I support some of the most vulnerable people within the society. Some of the issues that myself and my colleagues have faced during the COVID pandemic has been numerous. It's been a great burden on us. An example is having to do additional work hours and also increased responsibilities due to the COVID pandemic. And all these have been done with some colleagues without extra pay. And also, Black workers have been seriously affected as well in terms of having to worry about greater risk that COVID-19 poses. My question to the Scottish leader is, what specific actions will you take around pay and working conditions for carers?
I'm Eddie Gibb, I'm a care manager in social care and I am a member of Unite the Union. As the pandemic developed, I just think people started to think that they were to feel undervalued. I think social care workers have always felt undervalued. But then the rise to the pandemic, and they go out there and they do their job and they put everything into it. And then at some point during the pandemic, I think workers just started to realise that, okay, we're giving everything here, but we look at the politicians and we listen to what they're saying and what they're doing, and we don't feel supported. And then I think that again had a negative impact on people. So I really worry just now that if we have another, a spike in the pandemic, I think social care will really suffer like it's never suffered before. My question to the panel is, companies involved in the care sector are making so much profit, yet we have an undervalued and underpaid workforce. How do you plan to make the workforce more valued, better paid?
I've worked in social care for over 20 years. Throughout this pandemic, my colleagues have been through hell, and we are now fighting for proper recognition of the value of our work. In February this year, all political candidates received a letter from 1,500 GMB Scotland members working in social care, asking them to support our fight for £15. Do the candidates support the fight for £15? A £15 an hour minimum wage for care workers and pay rises for associated professions.
Thanks very much. That was a final question from the GMB, who also represent care workers. And this time, Alistair Carmichael, could we have your response to that?
Bill. Thank you very much. And to deal first of all with what would we do about pay, I think the move towards national collective bargaining for care workers would be probably the single most significant change we could make. I do have concerns that moving too quickly to the £15 per hour would have quite an inflationary effect within public sector pay generally. And as Nicola Sturgeon said earlier, whatever we're going to promise has got to be deliverable, and it's got to be affordable. So, we're looking at this, I think, within the context of Derek Feely's review of the adult social care sector. And I think there was an awful lot in that which had a lot to recommend it. The one thing that we're not keen on implementing, and we'll be upfront about this now, is the idea of a national care service. My concern about that, and the concern of my party as far as that's concerned, is that that sounds a bit like another reorganisation that involves a central service across the whole of Scotland, which inevitably, as you've seen with Police Scotland, with ambulance and fire and other services, has a very centralising effect. The provision of care in communities like mine in Orkney and in Shetland is going to be very different from the provision of care within the central belt communities, and you need to have the flexibility to address that properly, and we've seen from other services, in fact, when you go to that national-based model, you don't actually get that. But Derek Feely said two things. He said we had to move to a different narrative as well as resourcing, dealing with the question of resource and respect. And I think the problems with facing those who work in the care sector at the moment are about that narrative. It's not about the structure of the way in which their work is provided. And I think in government, we would want to see that different narrative being the priority.
Thank you. Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Chair. I actually think the single greatest failures and mistakes we made throughout the pandemic related to social care. And I think you only need to see the impact it's had on social care workers' mental health, the impact it's had on their wider families, many going back into work when suffering bereavement themselves, disproportionately also more likely to get COVID themselves, given the local environment. Us sending COVID positive patients into care homes is frankly unforgivable. And the care sector was pressured even before the pandemic. You can see that in terms of the vacancy rates and the turnover rates in staff. And the first question made a really important point. You're also disproportionately more likely to come from a BME background if you work in social care and all the impact that brings. So how do we support the sector? One is, as a proud GMB member, I'm happy that my own party helped lead the negotiations in the last budget around the fight for 15. I'm just disappointed we couldn't deliver that. We had very positive conversations, in fairness to Kate Forbes. I'm just unhappy we didn't get over the line. And that's why we made the commitment that we want to start with a starting pay of £12 an hour for our social care staff, rising to £15 an hour over the course of the next Parliament. I do support a national care service. I think it's important that we have national standards. I think it's important we have a national care service that has human rights at its heart. Also, we remove all non-residential charges and we make sure we have fairness for staff at the same time. I think all of that is fundamentally important if we are to build a care service worthy of the name. And how we support the workforce much more in the long term, I think, is crucially important. So proper investment, proper pay, national standards, and working together with different organisations and the unions to deliver that.
Thank you. Patrick Harvie.
Thanks very much. Yeah, the Scottish Greens do support the call for £15 an hour, and I honestly don't know whether it can be done in a single step or whether it will have to take a couple of steps to get there, as Anna suggests. But it should be recognised that, as the questioners put it, this is historically undervalued work, and I think this year that we've come through has shown us not just expose the fact that it was undervalued work all along, but also how critically important it is. Work like caring and cleaning are life and death critical to our society, and they will be again even after the pandemic. So this is a historic injustice that needs to be corrected. Over the course of the next Parliament, whatever the parliamentary arithmetic, there will be a debate about this idea of a national care service. And I understand what Alistair is saying about not wanting a centralised bureaucracy. I would be fine with the idea of local delivery. I think the default expectation, though, should be that delivery, even if it's locally controlled, is locally publicly owned, socially owned by the community, or owned by the workers. Because the fragmented nature of our care sector has been one of the huge problems, both during the pandemic and before, where there are some small operators that are very, very good and responsible, but there are also some really big ones extracting profits and stashing it in tax havens, for goodness sake. That kind of economics of care should be unacceptable, just as we would say it's unacceptable in much of the rest of the economy. So I would like to see the debate on a care service be about more than just national standards, but bringing the delivery into local, community and workers' hands as well. And I think that can be done in the next session of the Scottish Parliament.
Thank you. Stephen Kerr.
Yeah, this is an intensely personal issue for me, as it is for many other people in Scotland. Having seen what carers did for my mother in her final moments, I am indebted personally, as is my family, to the carers who were there for my mother at a very difficult time. So the Scottish Conservative position is that we need to have an urgent inquiry into what happened through this pandemic. I think it's sobering to listen to the videotape that we just listened to from those workers in the social care sector. We welcome the Feely review. We would welcome the idea of a national care service. We think there are many pluses to this. It's clearly something that needs to be explored, but the idea of having common standards and having a structure for the people that work in the sector as well is important. But what we wouldn't want is more bureaucracy, and we would absolutely want to learn the lessons of the other centralisations that have occurred by default to make sure that there was local democratic accountability. I'd also like to make the point that we have to have a realistic discussion about how we fund social care in Scotland, as is happening in other parts of the United Kingdom. And my final point would be this, that this is a subject where we can all come together. Scottish politics can sometimes be extremely divisive, as we all know, but this is a subject which is very close to all of our hearts. We have an ageing population and a real need for us to come together, all of the parties, to have a mature adult conversation about how best to take this forward. And I think if we work together, if we come together and work together, then we can come up with a sustainable, workable solution to this issue to take us into the future.
Thanks. Thank you, Stephen. Nicola Sturgeon.
If we're being blunt about it, and I think we should be blunt about it, as a society and historically, we have not valued our social care workforce nearly as highly as we should have done. It's a predominantly female workforce, disproportionately BME workforce. Not only at all times, but particularly during the pandemic, has that workforce done so much to help get us through and care for some of the most vulnerable. They've done that at huge personal risk to themselves because of the nature of the work that they do. As we come out of this pandemic, hopefully, I know the experience has made me more determined than ever that we tackle some of these deep-seated inequalities and injustices that the pandemic has exposed. And there's few things that I feel more strongly about coming out of this than valuing much more highly our social care workers. That's why I am so strongly supportive of a national care service. It is about national standards and quality, but it is also about over time removing and replacing that profit motive with community public ethos in its place. It also gives us the opportunity to move to a national wage for carers and national collective bargaining, which I think is really important. And as part of that, I do support the aspiration, hopefully over not a long period of time, to get to a £15 wage. We have to do that in a way that we know we can deliver and is affordable, but we have to aspire to doing that. And, you know, we in the meantime fund the payment of the real living wage as the basis on which we take that forward. But I think, and I hope there can be real consensus around this, because it should be one of the key priorities and key ambitions of the next Parliament.
Thanks very much, Nicola. Can I just maybe, Patrick Harvie raised the issue of whether should be private ownership in the social care sector. I think you said community ownership, Nicola, and social ownership would be the way forward. Just wanted to maybe hear from Anas and Alistair, because they came after Patrick. Where are you placed on the ownership of the social care sector?
Look, I think, and ideally you like it to be public ownership and largely there's a large voluntary sector, but there is a large private sector part of it as well. And I think we'd be wrong to say on day one we can get everything into public ownership. So I think we've got to see it as a partnership and get those national standards, get local accountability, get collective bargaining around the pay. But the more we can transition, I think, to public and voluntary sector and community ownership, the better. But I don't think we should pretend that's going to happen overnight.
Alistair?
Yeah, I mean, I think Anas is right about that. And personally, I'm always more inclined to judge by outcomes rather than by the sort of question of who's going to be providing and where they come from in that spectrum. I think that there is a big contribution that can be made and is often made by the third sector, as well as I've seen some tremendous work done by people working in the private sector. So judge it by outcomes, take what is appropriate in every given community, and take that as your starting point rather than as some determination to shoehorn it into a public or a private sector silo.
Right. I'm afraid we're going to have to move on again. I'm really sorry about this, because I think this would be a fertile area of debate about how that could maybe be accomplished. But the next section is important, and it's about jobs. The key questions on jobs and employment practice as we come out of the pandemic. We know some industries and employers will have radically changed during the course of the pandemic. So we're now going to hear from GMB and Unite the Union.
My name is Katrina Copeland and I work for Centrica, and I'm a member of the GMB. 7 months ago, we were all issued with an S188 notice, which is essentially fire and rehire. The business wanted to basically annihilate our current terms and conditions. We lost things like up to 5 days holiday. The engineers have to work an additional 3 hours a week. We lost sick pay. We are on up to a 5-year pay freeze. I could go on and on. There was so many changes to the terms and conditions, and it's created a mental health crisis in British Gas. My question is simply, would you outlaw fire and rehire practices? And do you support the devolution of employment law to Scotland to do this?
Hi, my name is Stella Rooney and I'm a member of Unite, and I sit on the STC Youth Committee. Work during COVID has been very difficult for so many people, but especially for young people. Many of us were already employed on 0 hours or minimum wage jobs. We didn't necessarily know how much money we were going to make in a week or a month, or when we could count on that money coming in or being paid to us. Our experience of work is often precarious, and often we're employed in the private sector, and it isn't delivering for young people like me. We want a plan for jobs, but not just any job. We deserve the right to have minimum amounts of hours, to have a living wage, and to have security in our lives. So when we begin to ease out of the lockdown, we need to build that security for young people in Scotland. Often we have had extortionate rents, higher bills during COVID, which is going to lead to higher levels of debt as well. So I would like to hear what you are going to do, you and your party, to tackle exploitative employment in Scotland, such as precarious employment or paying under the minimum wage, but also looking over the next 5 years. What is your plan to build well-paid, high-quality jobs for young people in Scotland?
Right, thank you. And as you can see, I've been joined by our cat, who's listening with expectation to the answers I'm going to be provided on those really important questions: fire and rehire and exploitative employment practices. Go first to Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, thanks to both Katrina and Stella for 2 critically important questions. To give a very straight answer to Katrina's question, yes, I would outlaw fire and rehire practices. I would do it tomorrow if I had the power to do it, but we don't, which is why the devolution of employment law is so fundamentally important. We need to get those powers out of the hands of Westminster and into the hands of a Scottish Parliament that I believe most parties, if not all parties, would use better than current Westminster governments. Those kind of practices are abhorrent, and we should call out employers who are trying to do things like that, but we need the power to do more than that, to actually make them illegal. But the devolution of employment law is also important to allow us to deal with some of the other problems in the labour market, to deal with precarious work, 0 hours contracts, exploitative practices more generally. But in the meantime, of course, we are using our Fair Work First approach to apply fair work practices to government contracts and grants. And, we do that already with the living wage, for example, and we are adding living hours to the criteria that we insist on through Fair Work First, which is minimum numbers of hours, for example, to give people greater protection. So we will seek to do what we can as a Scottish Government. I believe we have a duty to lead by example and to use existing powers to the max. I want us to extend and use even more the Fair Work First principles. But devolution of employment law would allow us to legislate. And I think on issues as important as this, actual legislation really matters.
Thank you. Stephen Kerr.
Yeah, Katrina and Stella raise very important points. And let me say straight off that there's no doubt that the economy structurally has changed because of the COVID pandemic. And that does mean working practices have changed and will continue to change. Much is changing around us before the pandemic came, and that change is going to only now be accelerated because of the pandemic. Having said that, employers who follow these kinds of practices, they are sharp practices. When people are made to feel insecure, their terms and conditions are changed unilaterally, they are threatened with their employment, none of that is acceptable and should be called out. That is the worst sort of practice. No, quite frankly and directly, I do not believe that employment law should be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. There are already many powers devolved to the Scottish Parliament that Nicola Sturgeon and her government have never got their arms around. We have powers in this country to tackle what is, I think, a huge priority after the public health crisis, which is the forecast by the Scottish Fiscal Commission of 200,000 people losing their jobs or being unemployed in Scotland, and that continuing pretty much for most of the next Parliament. We need to unite together as a country and focus on the issue of job creation. And for that reason, the Scottish Conservatives are proposing a plan for recovery that includes the creation of a network of job security councils where stakeholders in a given community come together to work together. That's why we are similarly building on the model of the city region growth deals to create economic development agencies in the regions. We have an ambitious plan on training and retraining. We have a commitment to unlimited apprenticeship opportunities for young people and so forth. So our focus will be laser-like on job creation, because that, and high quality, high paying jobs. We want a high value economy, not a race to the bottom economy. And that's what we should be focused on.
Sarwar.
Yeah. I get what Stephen's saying, but if Stephen's accepting that they are exploitative practices and we should unite across the country, then perhaps we should be uniting across the country to stop the exploitative practices of the likes of British Gas, which, to be frank, is an utter disgrace what they are doing with their staff. And they're not the only company that have been through that process or attempted that process. So I do support the devolution of employment law. I want the way that we devolve it, though, to set a floor across the UK and to devolve the power across the nations and regions of the UK, so we can try and have a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom across the UK. But a few other things within that. I think we do have the ability to do some things ourselves. Of course, I would like to outlaw 0 hour contract. I would like us to have the power about increasing the national living wage. I would like us to outlaw, for example, work shifts, unpaid work shifts, or work trials, which I think are completely unacceptable. But in terms of what we can do, I think we should be looking at our procurement powers. We spend about £13 billion in Scotland on procurement. What more can we do around procurement? I want us to set up Good Business Scotland, which means that no company that should get any contracts or grants from government unless they meet basic obligations around pay, around conditions, and also around carbon reduction plans, if we're true about our green credentials. In terms of for young people, I think apprenticeship pay is woefully low. We should be creating new apprenticeships. Our own party's proposed 5,000 new apprenticeships that are paid at almost double the current rate of apprenticeship pay. I want us to introduce rent controls, because there is too much exploitation of young people, in particular in terms of the housing market, and also to inspire a jobs guarantee programme to give a jobs guarantee for young people, the long-term unemployed, but also a new skills benefit to back that up, so people can access those new skills and then hopefully go into the new economy of the future. And there's a wider point, but I realise I'm coming out of time, around how we invest in the new economy of the future. I think how we restructure our job creation schemes across the country and business support schemes across the country have to emphasise that new economies of the future and new skills of the future, so we can get young people back into work in those economies of the future and also meet our green obligations at the same time.
Okay. Thank you, Alice. Alistair, Carmichael.
Thank you. On the question of fire and rehire, absolutely, this is a practice that has no place in the 21st century, and I think it really needs to be abolished, and it needs to be abolished across the whole of United Kingdom. And this does touch on the point about devolution. I've got no doctrinal objection to devolution, but employment law is something that is pretty much at the heart of the idea of a single UK market. And to take a couple of the examples of the most egregious examples of fire and rehire, it's been companies like British Airways and British Gas, and you can see how, as companies operating right across the UK, it wouldn't be that difficult for them to get around it. So my aspiration is to get rid of fire and rehire, but actually to do that for workers across the whole of the United Kingdom, because I care as much about workers south of the border as I do about workers in Scotland. In terms of other things that can be done, though, for fair employment practices, I think you have to recognise that government has a lot of power, soft power sometimes, in improving conditions, not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector. So, the question of how employees are treated by their employers, questions of things like are they paid the real living wage, is something that could be tied to public procurement contracts. And I just think the government in Scotland gave Amazon £5 million over a number of years, and their employment practices have been pretty woeful. So I think if you took that thinking right across the whole panoply of decisions that are made within government, then you could see that there's a lot more opportunity to do things with the powers that we've got, rather than looking just to further devolution.
Patrick Harvie.
Well, I certainly want to see an end to fire and rehire and other exploitative practices. It's unacceptable to say those are bad practices, but keep them legal. And I think it's outrageous to suggest that it's more important to protect the UK free market than it is to protect workers. If these issues had been devolved, if that devolution had not been blocked during the Smith Commission, we could already have outlawed this practice. We could already have outlawed age discrimination in the minimum wage and made it a real living wage for all. We could have repealed the anti-trade union laws that were passed by the Tory government, and we could have done much more than that. But there are things that we can do right now, even in publicly funded further education. We hear of the same practices, effectively fire and rehire happening within the devolved areas of responsibility, such as further education. So if we're serious about that commitment, we need to live by it as well in the areas that are currently under devolved power. The opportunity, though, to raise standards, particularly in sectors like hospitality, for example, where low levels of trade union membership go hand in hand with low standards of employment practice. We should be seeing a strong, lively and angry trade union movement as the ally of the public sector in trying to raise standards across the board. So I would pay tribute to Unite Hospitality for the work they've done trying to raise union membership and activism within hospitality. The last thing to say is we're really at a critical point in history at the moment where the entire economy is dependent on the action and support of the state. The role of the state is critical. So let's start setting some terms and conditions. The state can determine as we recover. I'm not against businesses getting some support in these difficult times and getting some tax breaks and other forms of support, that's fine. But let's set the conditions. Let's attach strings to it to make sure that the economy we rebuild is fundamentally not the broken economy that we had before the pandemic. Not just in Scotland, but around the world. This is a moment of opportunity for us to start asserting the principles upon which we want the economy to function, because it only functions with the support of the state. That's been exposed in an extraordinary way over the course of the last year.
Thank you, Patrick. Nicola, Sturgeon, maybe come back to you to respond to a couple of the things that have been said, but also maybe expand on some of the plans of your party for retraining and job creation in the wake of the pandemic.
Happy to do that. Just to pick up on a couple of the points that have been made, I agree we should attach conditions to government contracts and government funding. That's what we are doing in Scotland through Fair Work First. Since we published the action plan on that, terms and conditions around fair work principles have been applied to billions of pounds of government funding already, and we want to go further, both in terms of the coverage of that, but also the actual criteria that are attached to it. As I mentioned earlier on, living hours as well as the living wage. So I think it is really important that we maximise what we can do here, but we do need more powers here. And listening to this, I think we've all got to accept that there's not the proverbial snowball's chance and what of the Tories outlawing fire and rehire, nor I think is there any chance of them willingly devolving employment law, which brings to the fore the future of Scotland and whether we want all of these powers to lie with our Parliament through independence or allow a Tory government to continue to control things like that. And that's one of the big issues I think we've got to confront as a country. In terms of the wider point, we need to support reskilling as we come out of this pandemic. We have the National Transition Training Fund, which is helping to do that. We have already started a young person's guarantee, which I'm genuinely pleased to see all parties coming forward with proposals to back that. We mustn't have a legacy of youth unemployment from this pandemic, so guaranteeing jobs, training, education for young people is critically important, but also making sure as we invest in infrastructure and in the transition to net zero, that we are using that investment much better than we have done in the past to create the green, sustainable jobs for the future. So there are massive opportunities here, as well as the big challenges of the pandemic, and those opportunities come from that transition to net zero as we tackle climate change, and it's really important that we take full advantage of them.
Stephen Kerr, I know you wanted to say a wee bit more about the UK government's plans in the job creation and skills arena. So I'll give you another go to give us a wee bit more outline of what's planned.
Well, Bill, we did really well. We got to 56 minutes before Nicola Sturgeon mentioned independence. I thought we were doing rather well at this Hustings not to have mentioned independence. And frankly, that is the great threat to a recovery for Scotland, is this diversion, this whataboutery that Nicola Sturgeon regularly engaged in. The UK government certainly has ambitions. I mean, came into power after the December 2019 election on an agenda of levelling up. And levelling up is all about creating an equality of opportunity across this country, because there is currently an inequality of opportunity in different parts of the United Kingdom, as there is in different parts of Scotland. That's very clear. That's not a very controversial thing to say. I would like to say something else, a slightly different tact, and that is about SMEs, the small businesses in this country that are the backbone of our economy. And in support of them, I'd like to mention two things. And they employ a lot of people, by the way. And I'd like to mention two specific things in relation to them. One is there is a need to simplify the way that they get help from government. Currently, the business support landscape is cluttered. It is confusing. We need to simplify the way that support is given to SMEs. And I'd also, and secondly, I'd like to mention public sector procurement. It is undoubtedly a powerful way to bring about the change that so many people on this panel are discussing, including myself. And that's why the Scottish Conservatives have brought forward what we call a Scotland First procurement policy. Basically, having left the European Union, we are free from the restrictions and regulations that go with public sector tenders. And we would like to create an uneven playing field in favour of local SMEs, so that they get the opportunity to have the access to the public sector purse, which at the end of the day is only fair, and which will also generate economic growth locally, domestically, and that will increase good jobs as well. So those are the two things I'd like to mention in relation to SMEs and training.
Yeah, thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to move on again, but thanks for your contributions. We're staying with jobs, but we're turning to the education sector, which Patrick has already touched on, and it's over to the EIS and UCU trade unions.
My name is Anne Collins and I'm a secondary school teacher, teaching geography and modern studies, and I'm with the EIS union. I trained as a probationer teacher, and towards the end of my probation, then that's when COVID came in. So I've had to very quickly adapt to the sort of digital platform along with everybody else. However, where we've really felt an issue has been in terms of recruitment. Last year, the figures were really, really low. It was very, very difficult, and a lot of us were very, very worried about if we were going to be able to secure any employment, not even temporary, like not just permanent, but any employment at all. Particularly for myself, I retrained as a single mum and put myself through university and done the 4-year course, and then had left a full-time job to come into teaching, and I don't know that I would have done that had I known what the prospects were going to be. The question I have for the leaders would be, hundreds of supply, newly qualified and recently qualified teachers do not have any job security despite the need for teachers being greater than ever. How will you ensure that teachers are valued and that all those with a qualification have a stable and secure contract?
Hello, my name is Katie Nicholl-Baines. My pronouns are she, her. I am a project manager at the University of Edinburgh and a member of the UCU Edinburgh branch. My job is a fixed term contract, which means I know the date at which my contract will end. This has been the case for a lot of fixed term people at the university, many of whom's contracts ended early into the pandemic, which created huge insecurity at a time where job opportunities were few and far between. Lots of universities, including the University of Edinburgh, were going through hiring freezes, and we're in another hiring freeze at the moment, which means the most precarious and vulnerably employed people like me on fixed term contracts or those on guaranteed hours contracts are most at risk, because if their contract comes to an end, there's then no further opportunities for them to apply for. So my question to you is, how will you support the stable employment of administrative support workers in higher education who do vital work to ensure and sustain the important teaching and research work that is done at universities?
Thanks very much for those contributions. I've also got another question from EIS members in the audience tonight, and that's, do you agree that someone who teaches and assesses in Scotland's FE colleges should be recognised as a lecturer and as a result be employed on lecturers' terms and conditions? So valuing teachers, stable and secure contracts, supporting the stable employment of admin workers, and lecturer status for those employed in FE colleges. Patrick, Harvie, yourself first.
Yeah, I'm happy to give a simple yes to that last question from EIS. Earlier today, I was up chatting to some folk from UCU at Glasgow Uni, and on my way back, I happened to bump into an old friend I've not seen for many years, who's been working in higher education. I think they said for over 15 years now, and still on a fixed annual contract, still with no job security. So this is endemic. And I think there's a lot of recognition across society of insecure working conditions in areas like hospitality and retail. I think a lot of people who are not actually involved in higher and further education don't recognise how widespread those kind of practices are within colleges and universities. So we need to take responsibility for that. And we need the Scottish Government as the funder to take responsibility for that, and not simply say that employment practices that we would choose to ban if we had employment law devolved can continue within the education sector. In terms of teachers, yes, we think there needs to be a 10% increase in the recruitment of permanent teachers during the course of the next Parliament. That would be an extra 5,500. And there are something approaching 2,000 who are on insecure contracts who could take those permanent roles already. There clearly needs to be more investment into doing the training and recruitment over the long term to make sure that supply of new recruits is there. But we also need the job to be rewarding, so that folk don't feel that they've come into it and then they're looking for a route out of it. We need this to be a career that people feel secure in, not just that they have a secure contract, they feel that they're being looked after. And I think over the course of the last year in particular, a great many teachers and other school staff feel that their interests and their health and well-being has not been looked after, has not been a priority for the Scottish Government. So that's a culture change that's needed, as well as a change to people's direct terms and conditions.
Nicola, Sturgeon?
So let me take the three questions as briefly as I can. Firstly, on teachers. I mean, over the last session of Parliament, session just ended, we've seen recruitment of more than 3,000 additional teachers. Our manifesto commitment for the next Parliament is 3,500 extra teachers or classroom assistants. The majority of that, though, will be teachers. There's no reason why any probationary or newly qualified teacher in Scotland should not have employment, and there is no reason why that should not be permanent employment. Councils are the employers, not the Scottish Government, but I would certainly strongly encourage councils to focus on permanent, not temporary employment. Given what we face in education, given the commitment there to teacher recruitment, we should be absolutely making sure that that is secure employment. I don't agree that it's not been a priority of the Scottish Government to secure the health and well-being of teachers, but teachers have had a torrid time, as many others have had during the pandemic, and we've got to recognise that as we come out of this. In terms of universities and colleges, we are the funders of universities or partially the funders in terms of universities, but universities are independent institutions. We don't set their employment practices, but I do think it's fair to say, as we try to take on the problem of insecure, precarious work in other sectors, we should expect universities to lead by example, and the Scottish Government needs to, be firm in having those discussions. The last question is around lecturers. I do support the status of lecturers. In Scotland, lecturers are GTC registered, and as I understand in the dispute, there have been productive discussions around resolving that dispute, and I hope we see a resolution to it very soon.
Thank you. Could we have Stephen Kerr?
Yeah, so on the issue of teacher recruitment, I mean, there are 1,700 fewer teachers in Scotland's schools than there were when the SNP first came to power in 2007. And the Scottish Conservative commitment at this election is to recruit 3,000 more teachers, and particularly in terms of recruiting teachers who will bring STEM subjects into the classroom. It is really shameful that the SNP record, I'm afraid, in government on schools, our education system, which was once envied, is no longer the case. The withdrawal from international league tables is not the way to deal with falling standards. We need to get behind our teachers. The teachers are the key to restoring Scotland's education. We want to tackle the issues such as classroom sizes. I mean, when the SNP came to power in 2007, they had a commitment of reducing P1 to 3 class sizes to 18, they've never achieved that, and that's something that we as Scottish Conservatives want to see happen. Multi-level teaching has never been more endemic than it is now, and the truth is that no one has been properly standing up for teachers in Parliament except for the Scottish Conservatives. We have repeatedly made the case for teachers' health and well-being, particularly during the pandemic, and our teachers should be thanked and congratulated. They've done an amazing job, despite the fact that in many instances they were never given, have not been given the proper kit to be able to conduct online classes. Let's make every Scottish school a good school. That would be our policy and approach. At the minute, for example, in infrastructure terms, 10% of Scotland's schools are considered to be in a poor or bad condition. That's 60,000 Scottish children going to school in substandard classrooms. That has got to be rectified. There are many issues in relation to our education system that need to be addressed, and time doesn't allow them to be properly aired tonight. But I will make one point on the colleges. The colleges are key to Scotland's recovery. They are at the very heart of the training effort that we need to put in. And the fact is, the SNP, Scottish Government, have actively defunded the college sector. They've reduced the size of the sector. They've reduced the money that's been available to them. And we need to restore funding to Scotland's colleges. They are at the heart of our economic recovery programme.
Anna Sarwar.
Thanks again, Chair. I'll take them in reverse order, if that's okay. On the final question, absolutely I agree, unequivocally. On the second one, about the UCU disputes, I think Patrick touched upon this, and I think he's right. The challenge is, I've lost count of the number of disputes there have now been that the UCU have had to go out and campaign on and protest on and have picket lines on in order to get fairness from either the college or university sector. And one of the things that really struck me is how supportive students are of their lecturers in those very processes. So I think the Scottish Government has got to be more interventionist and put much more pressure on the college and university sector in terms of getting this right. It feels like the disputes go on far too long, and we wait until we're far too long down the process until there's government intervention. I think we've got to be much more interventionist in that, because there's now been far too many disputes, and it's just not fair or not just for how that happens. Similar to that around schools, I think it's important to say that teachers play a massive role in schools, but the support staff around teachers also helps to deliver the kind of education we want in Scotland. The way we're going to address it is adequate numbers. I think we've got fewer teachers now than when the SNP came to power. We have fewer specialist teachers and additional support teachers since 2012. That's not good enough. So we've got to get adequate numbers, get the teacher numbers up, get the ASN teacher numbers up. Of course, pay and conditions is an important part of that, but resourcing is also an important part of that. We talked about local government funding in the first question. There are too many teachers who are having to go out and buy resources for their own classrooms all the time. That's not good enough. That's not acceptable, and that helps reduce morale. It helps make more people leave the profession early or be not attracted to come and work in the profession, which is simply not good enough. So how do we resource staff, resource teachers? And then also the last year, the digital divide has been really, really difficult for teachers as well, not just for kids, but for teachers. How do we give proper digital training and recognise that additional support that teachers need so we can have an education system that's once again the envy of the world?
Alistair, Carmichael.
Thank you, Bill. Can I thank the EIS members who put in that final question there about the status of college lecturers, because I was listening to the preceding videos, and sympathetic to both though I was getting increasingly frustrated that somehow or another always seems to be the colleges that get left behind there, the poor relations. And as we seek to build our way out of the consequences of the COVID pandemic, the role of our colleges in retraining and upskilling our workforce is going to be absolutely central and critical, and according the lecturer status, I think would be an important indication of our understanding of the importance of the role that they perform. The casualisation of our teaching force has now got to a stage where it is frankly no longer sustainable. The EIS estimate, I think, that 1 in 10 teachers at the moment are on casual contracts. And, we find the number of teachers who are working on 0 hours contracts. Will there any spoke in the Scottish Parliament just at the turn of the year there about one who had been 6 years on temporary contracts. So that's why I think an idea like a teacher job guarantee is going to be absolutely critical. And I think teachers deserve a new look, a re-examination of their pay and conditions, looking at the amount of contract time they have, looking at their routes to promotion and their whole job and career structures. Because, having this massive chunk of our teaching staff filled by people who themselves are not secure in their job isn't just bad for the teachers. I see it as a parent. When my children who recently came through the secondary school system were constantly being put in front of supply teachers and who did not have that continuity of teaching, then actually the product for them at the end of the day was that much poorer. So it is about according teachers the status that they earn and that they deserve, and that has got to come with the jobs guarantees that, frankly, I do not see how they can possibly continue without.
No. Can I bring Patrick back in? I could see a few looks crossing your face, Patrick, as some of the other speakers were speaking on this subject. Can you got a few more words to say on it?
I think the broadest smile across my face was when Stephen claimed that the only people standing up for teachers have been the Conservatives. I'm not sure anyone who's actually been in the Scottish Parliament over the last few years would recognise that description. Look, I genuinely hope that this is a moment when we can look to some of the deep underlying issues within our education system and see this as an opportunity for change, certainly to deal with the pressures that folk have been enduring for the last year, but also to actually recognise that we have an education system that is still teaching people according to a model that was designed not just in the 20th century, but the 19th century. And if we're going to reinvent, if we're going to see educational recovery, we should be taking a leaf from some of the most progressive countries in the world that have changed completely the approach to early years education, for example. That have tried to make sure that schools are able to innovate and be creative, and that have absolutely invested in the role of further and higher education in a more profound way. Let's hope that there is some space for some genuine creative thinking across all the political parties in the next session, because just like everything else, this shouldn't be a bidding war. I know we've all said, how many teachers we want to recruit and everything, but this shouldn't just be a bidding war about targets. This needs to be a moment to go back and think from first principles about how we achieve the kind of educational change that's necessary without it just ending up as yet another round of reorganisation and stress and paperwork for the folk doing the job.
Nicola, Sturgeon, a lot of consensus around some of these issues. Any final words on this?
I always welcome consensus on these issues. Sometimes it struggles to maintain itself once we get into the actual detail. But I do think this, look, if we can try to find areas of consensus in a time like this, then, we never will. So let's not shy away from the things that we disagree on. We disagree on quite fundamental things, and that's the heart of democracy. But where we can actually agree, we should agree. And I think you've heard agreement tonight broadly on a national care service. And I think there's a lot of agreement about investment in early years in education, about the need to make sure that our public sector leads by example in tackling unfair, precarious work, and making sure that we value public sector workers, teachers and lecturers included in that. So I'm hopeful that we can build a bit of common purpose around these things as we go into the next session of Parliament.
Right. Thanks very much. We're now going to go to closing statements, which will each last 2 minutes approximately. And thanks to all the panelists for keeping largely to time throughout. So we'll start with Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Bill. At this election, clearly Scotland has a choice. Another 5 years of division over breaking up Scotland or uniting and rebuilding our country. Our priority must be recovery and not another referendum. Our focus must be on jobs and on the businesses and the workers that create them, with equal opportunity for all and for training. We, Scottish Conservatives, will get record investment into our NHS so that the doctors and nurses and carers have what they need to clear the backlog of treatment. And we owe it to our young people to restore Scottish education. We will recruit 3,000 additional teachers, as I just mentioned, reduce class sizes, and see that no child in primary school is sitting in a classroom on an empty stomach. We need to tackle violent crime and drugs. We need more police officers on our streets. And the law must be on the side of the victims of crime and not the criminals. And we will put into law that councils get the funding they need to enable council workers to deliver the local services that we all depend on. The SNP, put bluntly, has been stealing their funding for years. We need local powers for our communities, rather than the government in Edinburgh dictating everything from the centre. The SNP power grab of recent years must be put into reverse. Don't wish for a better future for Scotland. Vote for one. Vote to reunite and rebuild Scotland by voting Scottish Conservative.
Thank you, Stephen. Patrick Harvie.
And thank STUC for organising tonight's husting and inviting us to take part. I wish to goodness that we'd been in a room and you were able to heckle us and engage in a really more active way. I hope it won't be too long before we do that. There's so much in the discussion that I could pick up on that there isn't time. I do believe that during the next session of the Scottish Parliament, Scotland does have to make a serious choice. Do we think that the task of recovery from COVID, the task of closing the wealth and inequality gap in our society, the task of responding to the climate and nature emergency, are we best placed to respond to these tasks as a small independent country with the option of getting back into the European family of nations? Or are we best placed responding to these challenges as part of Boris Johnson's Brexit Britain? You know where I stand on that one. And I think most of the trade union movement recognises that Scotland does have a right and a need to make that decision consciously rather than have Boris Johnson tell us we're not allowed to. But look, the last thing I want to say is, as I said earlier, this is an extraordinary moment of opportunity to begin to shape a new economy rather than just reboot the old broken economy. And if we're going to do that, we need to have courage. This is not managerialism. We're not the Board of Management of Scotland PLC. This is a political debate and we need to be open to these political options. And the role of trade unions is going to be critical in shaping the kind of economy that we rebuild. We've not talked much about the climate emergency during today's discussion, but one of the things that I find hopeful is that today's younger generation, like the youth climate strikers, are rediscovering the power of collective action. And any political party, whoever wins the election, whatever the balance is in the next parliament, any political party that believes in progressive causes and a fairer and more equal society should see a strong, vibrant trade union movement as critical to achieving that, because it's about shifting power within our economy, not just changing the names on ministers' office doors.
Thank you. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you also to STUC for hosting this tonight. Let me start off by saying something that might surprise some of you. I think Patrick's absolutely right. He's right that this is a moment where there is demanded of us a massive response. And you have to understand the sheer scale of the task that will be facing us as we start to rebuild after this pandemic. That's why right at the start of lockdown, I was out there promoting the idea of a universal basic income, something that I might not have done a year or two ago, but for which I can see the need now. And that's the sort of change that we're going to have to rush to embrace. I would suggest to you, though, that you can only embrace that scale and nature of change if you are able to put the divisions of the past behind you and to pull everybody together. It was quite interesting, I thought, that in the course of the discussion around jobs and employment, both Patrick and Nicola managed to make that as a question about independence. Now, just as trade unionists, you will know that one of the most important things that has been at the centre of your history is this notion of solidarity. And that's why actually I think this is a moment for putting our divisions behind us, for putting the recovery first and parking the constitutional debate, because the changes that we've all identified tonight are not just changes that are relevant to people in Scotland, they are just as relevant to people in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. You're not going to solve them by drawing a line in the map. You're not going to solve them by pretending that somehow or another their problems are less important than ours. That's why when we do come to vote, please to put recovery first. It is what is demanded of us by our people at a moment like this.
Thank you. And we'll move straight on to Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, thanks to the STUC again for organising tonight's hustings. I offer three related things at this election. Firstly, continued leadership to get us through the crisis. You know, today's been a positive day, the biggest step so far out of this lockdown, but we're not out of COVID yet. There are risks remaining and we need to take a careful, steady, cautious route through this, one that prioritises human health and human life and safely opens up the economy and society. Secondly, a transformational programme for government that focuses on recovery, but not just any recovery, the right recovery, one founded on the right values and one that doesn't just take us back to the way things were, but seeks to build a better country, better society and a better economy. So the National Care Service, action on child poverty, a green recovery and looking at doing things differently. A 4-day working week perhaps, and yes, a minimum income guarantee paving the way for a universal basic income. And then when the crisis is over, giving people in Scotland the choice of becoming independent, because actually, contrary to what Alistair has just said, where power lies really matters. I'd love to see a universal basic income across the whole UK. I'd love to see fair work across the whole UK. I just don't want Scotland to have to wait on a Tory government delivering these things for the rest of the UK before we can take them forward as well. Now, within the trade union movement, there are, just as in Scotland as a whole, there are different opinions on independence or not. But what I really welcome is the STUC's support for that basic fundamental democratic principle of the right to decide. Scotland's future should be up to the people of Scotland. And I believe if we choose independence, then we really can build for the long term the better country we all know and believe Scotland can be.
Thank you. And finally, Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the SUC and all the affiliated trade unions for the opportunity to speak to you today and for the questions. Look, we all thanked our frontline workers right at the start of this debate, and we've all spoken about how we can turn that thanks into genuine recognition and action. And I think the best way we can thank all our frontline workers and workers across the country is if for a change we focus on what unites our country rather than what divides it. Because I'm not willing to only put forward a programme for the half of the country that agrees with me on the Constitution. I want us to have a programme that works for everyone across Scotland, because we had inbuilt structural inequalities even before COVID. Structural inequalities that were for people that were low pay, for women, for people on BME communities and people from different parts of the country. And the sad reality is that COVID has exacerbated those inequalities, not helped to address them. And we have a huge backlog of issues to now confront that were also there pre-COVID, but have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And the idea that this crisis ends the day the lockdown ends, or the day hopefully sometime soon the virus disappears, is just not true. 360,000 of our fellow citizens are on furlough, worried about if and when they'll have a job to go back to. We know there are 7,000 undiagnosed cancers over the last year and over 500,000 of missed cancer screening programme visits. We know there are 1,500 children who are waiting over a year for their mental health care. We know there's a huge backlog and action needs to happen around cuts to public services, cuts to local authorities, and all the pressure on our frontline work. I want to work with each and every single one of you. I don't care whether you were yes, no, leave or remain. I don't care. I want to work with each and every single one of you so we can rebuild the country we love and come through this most difficult of years and build a fairer, more just nation. But that work starts on the 6th of May. Thank you again to the SGUC.
And can I say thanks again to all tonight's panellists. Thanks very much for all your contributions. Also want to thank the BSL signers, been doing a fantastic job. And thanks to everyone for attending. And I'm going to pass straight over to Ros Foyer, the General Secretary of the STUC, for some final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And can I add a huge thanks to all the panellists tonight, and a special thanks to you, Bill Scott, for chairing tonight's hustings. Bill is, for those of you who don't know, the chair of Scotland's Poverty and Inequality Commission, and he brings years of experience working for social justice organisations and campaigning for workers' rights. Tonight, Scotland's workers asked our politicians about what action they will take to deliver the people's recovery we so badly deserve, and specifically what action will be taken on pay, action on care, and action for delivering good, high-quality jobs. So we heard from the politicians an interesting debate on the affordability of giving workers a decent pay rise, but our answer to that would be this: we need action now on pay, because delivering decent pay isn't a luxury, it's a well-deserved essential step if we're going to put money in workers' pockets to aid economic recovery in our communities. On care, let's be absolutely clear, we need a national care service with the profit element removed from social care, and perhaps that could actually ensure the affordability of the decent paying conditions for care workers, high standards for service users, and delivery of a care service that we can be really proud of. So we need sectoral collective bargaining right across this sector, and we welcome the acknowledgement that care work is undervalued and that the aspirations are there to remove the profit element. So we will certainly look to follow up with the new government on these actions. And on jobs, the action we need has to be centred around good, high quality jobs. The disgrace of fire and rehire needs to be halted, and we really welcome all of the calls for devolution of employment law, which is something the STUC also supports. But I have to say, existing powers are not being used to the max to ensure fair work right now, and they should be. So we look forward to further discussion with the new government about how we can use all levers at our disposal through procurement, grants, licensing, and many other support mechanisms that the public sector and the state provide to enforce a fair work first approach so that we can really build high quality unionised jobs going forward. And precarious employment in our colleges and universities must be addressed. We need investment in education, an end to the commercialisation of our HE and FE sector, and crucially, an end to the downgrading of our lecturers. And as we move out of this pandemic, we're going to be faced with huge challenges across the economy. So although the role of politicians is very important, it's important that we remember we can't just rely on politicians alone to deliver for us. We need a strong collective response in our workplaces, and we will also be needing trade unions to protect pay, conditions, and fight for jobs on the ground. We've seen trade unions at their best in the last year. They've supported workers throughout this pandemic, putting health and safety right to the top of the agenda. And going into this election and beyond, we agree that trade unions are essential in shaping the recovery. We don't want to go back to how it was before, because before wasn't working for far too many workers. So please join our movement and join our fight for a people's recovery that puts ordinary working people first. We need real action on pay, action on care, and action for jobs. And we would ask all of you to join us in making these demands from our politicians as we move forward. Contact your local candidates. Use your online tool to lobby your parliamentary candidates. Let them know that pay, care and jobs are the issues that matter to you, and make sure that you join a trade union if you're not already in one. And if you are already a member, get involved in your union. We need to build a movement that's going to ensure workers, their families and communities have a say in the recovery ahead. It's more important now than ever. So I want to thank you all for engaging in this hustings. And remember, when you head out to vote in this very important election, make sure you vote for candidates and parties that will deliver on a real people's recovery for Scotland's workers. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.